Good morning, everybody. This is Rob Beutling with HNDB. We are here for the Wisconsin SimCap meeting, the June edition. Just make sure that we're all on the right plane, going to the right spot. If you are, please, see your ticket agent and make sure that what happened is we can get fixed for you. But anyways, we'll go through a quick SimCap update from a national perspective. And I think Rebecca Zimkowski was going to help provide an update on the DOT side. I don't know if I see her name quite yet. Rebecca,
I'm here,
okay, great, thank you. And then we'll turn it over to Smith Soroma School. Did I say that right? Soroma School?
Soromoskal. You're close.
Soromoskal. All right, but the emphasis is on a different syllable, so Soromoskal. Okay, but he's going to talk through some DDI best practices as here in Wisconsin, we're starting to focus a lot more on those and see those around. So real quick, just kind of logistical type stuff. We are recording, as I said earlier, we are recording the meeting, and we'll edit this first part out and get that posted onto ITE Wisconsin SimCap page. So share that with your friends and family if you'd like. Questions, feel free to put them in the chat. I'll keep an eye on that, and we'll get those answered as when we can. Everything else, let me know. But I think we're set to go. So from a national SimCap meeting perspective, there is the meeting tomorrow from 2 to 3:30 Eastern time. So that would be 1 to 2:30 local time here in the central. Lots of good information on these national meetings. These SimCap meetings have been joint Sim Sub meetings, and lots of great information shared. So Eric Trippy is the SimCap chair, and Chris Melson is the Sim Sub co-chair with John Shaw. Some of you may recognize that name, but FHWA has provided a lot of great updates on projects that they've been working on. And there's been a lot of good presentations shared. So if you do have the time and availability, there is a link here. I can send this out. This is a PDF, and this is a Teams link, and I'll try and post that in the chat, see if I can make that work for you. But this is again tomorrow from 1 to 2:30 Central Time. And the next meeting is planned to be in person, is part of the annual ITE meeting in New Orleans. It's scheduled right now to be at 2 o'clock Central Time on Monday, August 1st. And they are going to look into seeing if they can't make a call-in available for that. So more information to come on that. All right. Any questions on the national stuff? Any other input that others may have? All right, then I'll turn it to Rebecca for any DOT updates.
Yeah, thanks, Rob. I just have two, I'd say, small updates. The first one is that the new highway capacity manual came out earlier this year. So if you have any projects that you want to start using the new highway capacity manual methodologies, you can. We'll accept those. You can continue to use the previous version of the highway capacity manual through the end of the year. But if you have any projects that'll start after January 1st, 2023, we're going to require using the new highway capacity manual methodologies. Now, I know there's always transition with projects and things, so the best advice is to contact your local region traffic engineer to make sure that's the right method you should be using. But if you have any questions, you can always reach out to BTO and Vicki Haskell for any questions regarding that. The other update is just for an FYI that in BTO, we had a new engineer start, the UW Platteville grad. His name is Lucas Beckwith. I think he's on. Yeah, he's on. So he's going to be kind of listening in on some of the stuff here and kind of getting acquainted with the terminologies and modeling stuff that we're doing, but just wanted to give you guys a heads up in case he attends meetings or shows up in emails, or you might be corresponding with him at some point. So wanted to welcome Lucas to BTO and DOT. Otherwise, that is it, unless anybody has any questions.
All right. If there are no questions, I am going to stop sharing my screen. Smith, you can start sharing yours. I am also going to mute everyone, all the attendees. So,
Please
Smith,
don't mute Whitney. She is going to be co-presenting with me. So make sure you
okay. Maybe you guys can unmute yourselves. I'm just going to do a standard mute. So Whitney, if when I do that, I'm going to click on the button now. And Whitney, you can then unmute yourself when you feel like it, if you can.
Okay.
Does that sound good? Okay, I think we can hear you. And we can see the presentation. So Smith and Whitney, please take it away. Thank you very much for attending too, or for presenting. We appreciate it.
Fabulous. Let me see if I can. Good. That works too. Excellent. I like to draw and I like to point at stuff. So good morning. My name is Smith SimCap. I'm here to present with Whitney Schroeder. And what we're here to talk about are the WIS traffic analysis best practices for diverging diamond interchanges. And we are going to talk specifically about VISIM, primarily because that was what we were scoped to do, and that's how the document was written. But that also means that we're going to get into the weeds on some things. So if you have any questions, pound away on the chat window. I will get to them when I can. So basically, what I want to start with is just my resume, or HDR's resume in terms of DDIs. I have about 20 that I've worked on personally that are now open to traffic. And we've worked on them coast to coast. We've worked on them across the planet, actually. A couple of the ones in Australia that are underway, under construction. One is open, one is about to break ground. But the gist of it is we've seen a lot of DDIs in a lot of different places, and we've done a lot of the different kinds of analysis that you'll see on diverging diamond interchanges in different contexts, different areas, and things like that. So this is what I want to talk about today. I want to talk briefly about software selection, about how to do a rough rule of thumb in terms of developing lane configurations, because it is pretty straightforward to look at a set of volume diagrams and just go, this is where I think I should start. And I'll walk you through a little bit of that. And then we're going to get hardcore into modeling details. And this will involve, you're going to need quite a bit of familiarity with some of the ISIM details in order to get the most out of the back end of this presentation. So let's start with software. In terms of HCM, HCS, it's yes, the DDI is included. No, you can't actually take a look at progression. No, you can't really look at cycles or developing signal timings. There are a whole host of things that make it somewhat impractical to really do a decent analysis of a DDI and HCM, to be completely honest. If you're finding one that is in the middle of an isolated space with nothing around it, that's one thing. But take, for example, what you see on the screen right here. This is the I-25 DDI in Cheyenne, Wyoming. This is just south of I-90. It's a very small one, but the gist of it is, if you look at it, there's a lot of access points that are immediately adjacent to the interchange. And there, with almost any DDI I can think of, there are going to be complications that make it such that even at a fatal flaw level, you really don't want to be relying on HCM in order to do your analysis. Now, I've seen a lot of analyses or a lot of studies that have used Synchro to justify looking at a DDI or considering a DDI. Now, here are a couple of major things that present issues for Synchro. What you see on the screen is one of the first, I think this was the first DDI that we put in the state of North Carolina. This is just north of Charlotte, and this is in the town of Concord, North Carolina. There are two that we put in on this design build that are side by side, one at Poplar Tent Road, the other one at NC 73. This one that you see here on the screen, it used to have a full-blown three-legged intersection right here. And what you'll notice about this is we converted that into basically a three-legged R-cut. So it allows the left turn in but everybody coming out of that road needs to go down to the west, U-turn, and come back around. What this means, though, is that you have a whole bunch of different elements that require advance notice, so to speak. So, for example, if you're coming down this ramp, you're going to position yourself in a different place on that triple right turn, depending on whether or not you're trying to make this hook to go north or whether or not you're trying to go through. In synchro, you don't have the ability to give vehicles brains. Basically, what you do in synchro carries over to sim traffic, but in synchro and sim traffic, basically the gist of it is a car only sees the next decision. That's it. Whatever decision is in front of it. It has no ability to pre-plan for the decision after the one that it's about to take. So when you're looking at DDIs or when you're looking at anything that has a lot of decision points that are stacked up on top of each other, in real life, the lane utilization isn't balanced because it's governed by what people are going to do after they do the thing they're about to do. So realize that synchro, because of the way you can code in the inputs, it really doesn't give you that capability to really accurately determine lane utilization imbalances that might result from whatever you're putting in the field. Then on top of that, synchro is not great about the freeways, and I'll get to why that's important in a little bit. Another thing is each one of the crossovers is a cluster of intersections. It's not just one. So that also presents a problem that you get into when you start looking at blocking and how things are platooning from intersection to intersection. Another issue is if this is in a corridor, synchro really doesn't like the fact that phases 2 and 6 cannot run together when you're in a DDI. And what that means is you basically blow out your time-space diagram. It doesn't work terribly well. And here's something that's buried in there. If you're planning on taking the synchro file and converting it into sim traffic, yes, you can code a DDI to sort of look like a DDI, but at the end of the day, one of the two crossover maneuvers is treated as if it's a diagonal turn. And that because it's not a through movement and it's treated as a diagonal turn, you can't put in a running speed higher than 25 miles per hour. That doesn't matter on an interchange like the one that you see here, but on some of the larger ones that we've worked on in Florida with crossover design speed is 35 or 40 miles an hour, it can make a substantial difference. So if you're scoped to do synchro and that's all you really got, there are ways to trick synchro into doing a DDI plausibly well. And it involves putting into the synchro file something that looks like the right side, not the left side. Basically, your DDI is not going to remotely look like a DDI. But what you can do is you can trick synchro into giving you the analysis of the intersection itself and how well the signal works. So what you're basically doing is for example, that movements A and C can run at the same time. So you group them in such a way that you create a split phase signal. So groups A and C run at the same time. B and D can run at the same time, and you translate that similarly over to the second phase of your signal. The other thing that you need to account for in a DDI is the fact that your through movements aren't really turns, but they're not really throughs because they're going through reverse curvature. So the lower your design speed of that curvature, the lower you have to make your saturation flow rate. The default saturation flow rate in synchro is 1900. You want to adjust that down to 1650 if you're running at a 25 mile an hour, or maybe as high as 1800, but you're not going to get your standard saturation flow rate through the intersection. The other thing to note is if you have a substantial distance, and I'll get into why this is important here in a little bit. If you have a substantial difference in that distance or in this distance, you really have to recognize that synchro can't really determine the effects of the nuances of delay and trail grain. And I will get into what those mean in a little bit. In terms of translation over to sim traffic, the thing is you really need to look at simulation in order to account for how platooning and progression really affects not just the DDI's ramp terminals, but the adjacent intersections up and downstream. It's important to determine how the DDI releases traffic into the rest of the network, and it's also important to see how that traffic gets accepted from elements upstream that flow into you. And again, with sim traffic, you're still held to the fact that synchro only sees one movement at a time. Therefore, sim traffic only sees one movement at a time. And there's nothing you can really do to stop cars from making that movement or to make other movements that are somewhat illogical. And the other element of the equation is you can't really tell how a DDI versus a single point versus a partial cloverleaf versus a tight diamond, how those interchanges will impact how traffic flows onto the freeway. And there is a difference in how that actually makes that impact. Now, in terms of lane configuration, and I'll get into the mainline impacts in a little bit, but in terms of lane configuration, really what you're looking at is the fact that from a signalization standpoint, the off-ramp left turn, you need to signalize that off-ramp left in a situation where you have more than one left turn. So if you have a dual left or a triple left, signalize it. The other reason to signalize an off-ramp left turn is if it goes into a trap lane, like what you see on the screen here. The leftmost lane of the core going westbound through here becomes a trap to go southbound on I-25. This is the I-25 DDI at Fillmore Boulevard in Colorado Springs. It's been open for about almost 8 years at this point. So realize that is how to signalize, whether or not to make the call to signalize left. If you're going to put in an interchange like this, the other thing to think about is whether or not you signalize the off-ramp right. And in this case, the off-ramp right, you're going to want to signalize it for the same reasons. If you have a dual turn lane, you need to signalize it. If you got a bunch of pedestrian traffic, you need to signalize it. And the other thing is you want to bring them into a signal and avoid using a free flow right turn if there are any downstream access points that are immediately adjacent, such as the west end of this interchange. It basically flows out of the ramp terminal and immediately opens up into right turn bays and left turn bays. So in order to mitigate any potential safety issues, any concerns with how those open up and any kind of merging and weaving, you really ought to look at not doing a free flow right, even though that may be simpler. So when you're looking at a DDI through here, through these two crossovers, a general rule of thumb, 750 vehicles per hour per lane for the through lanes and 600 vehicles per hour per lane for the off-ramp left turn lanes. I'm not saying that those are hard and fast numbers, but those are really useful rules of thumb when you're trying to lay out the initial lane configuration for additional analysis. Left turn on red, that strictly depends on the applicable statutes for the area, for the state, what have you, for the city, depending on where you're putting it. As far as right turn on red is concerned, basically, same thing. Follow the WISDOT guidelines that are already laid out in the TSDM. Now, I'm going to pass it over to Whitney for a little bit of a self-introduction before she gets into the nuts and bolts of VISIM setup.
Hi, everyone. I'm Whitney Schroeder. I'm out of HDR's Minneapolis office, and I helped out on the VISIM for I-41 in Wisconsin. So I'm going to start with getting into some of the setup components needed to build the VISIM model. So the two critical items that you'll start with are a reference file or background image, and then your extents. The background image is extremely important. You'll want to either base it on a CAD or microstation file and or aerials. The distances between your ramps, your crossover locations, as well as any upstream or downstream intersections will be very important to ensure that the network is operating realistically and accurately. Also, your extents, you want to make sure that your extents and your network stretch far enough to capture all the elements that you need. So this includes signalized intersections within 1,500 feet, unsignalized access points with volumes over 100 vehicles per hour that are within 1,000 feet, and then additionally, just anything that will affect your lane utilization and your progression. So next, as we get into coding our links, we are going to take into account the length of those links. So we want to make sure that they're long enough so that traffic can adequately set up in logical lanes. For one lane, you'll want inputs between 500 and 1,000 feet. For two-lane inputs, you want a little bit longer, up to 2,000 feet. And for three-lane inputs, 3,000 plus feet. Freeway links are obviously different. Those are quite a bit longer. So those are usually 5,000 feet at a minimum. One thing you want to make sure to avoid is when you are establishing your routing, you want to avoid point-to-point routing. So VISIM provides several different vehicle routing types. Static routing is what's generally used, and that's done by either point-to-point routing or origin-destination routing. The difference is that point-to-point routing is when vehicles encounter multiple decision points through the model, whereas OD routing would be when vehicles know where they want to go from start to finish. The reason we want to avoid point-to-point model or point-to-point routing is that the more decision points you add to the network, the more problems you can run into with vehicles not having enough time or space to change lanes at intersections, for example. So some point-to-point routing is okay, like mainline to interchange routing, but point-to-point along an arterial can be very problematic for vehicles getting stuck.
Absolutely. And the other thing to think about is point-to-point routing, for example, on the intersection to the south, maybe not that big a deal because everything's single lane. So people really can't set up in the wrong lane per se. But at the on the VISN model that you see to the upper right, that is the I-75 at University Parkway VISN model. And all the turns there, the right and left turns off the ramps are triple turns. It goes onto an arterial that's 4 lanes in each direction. The turn bays at the adjacent intersections are triples. Lane utilization is absolutely critical to get right for that. So yes, never, ever, ever use point-to-point routing when you're dealing with things, with elements, decision elements that are that close together.
The next inputs will be setting emergency stop distances, look back distances, and calibration. So you want to make sure you don't use the defaults that the software provides. The reason for that is that oftentimes they're too short, and that results in unrealistic behavior. It doesn't give the vehicles enough time and space. So these are the recommended distances that should be entered. And then it's kind of an iterative process, so you'll have to calibrate and adjust as needed.
Okay, what you see on the right side of the screen is the Oneida interchange, is the Oneida DDI is built up there in the Northeast region. And one of the things that what Whitney is talking about is the fact coming off of this right turn is right here. It basically opens up immediately into a left turn bay just south of the interchange. You need to make sure that people are in the model are lining up to where they need to be, because the software defaults are unrealistically short and they'll lead to some really unusual lane change behavior. One of the things that you really want to look at when you're looking at adjusting emergency stop and lane change, when you run your VISN model, take a look at the error file. When you look at the error file, look for any of the vehicle dissipation errors that involve vehicles waiting to do a lane change that are unable to make a lane change, and they get removed from the model. So done right, if you set up your e-stop and your lane change distances properly, your error file should be pretty much void of any of those vehicle dissipation errors.
So in establishing the VISM link types, it's important to code links as the correct behavior type because that determines how those vehicles will interact within that given link. So for the display type that you see here, the blue and the pink, you also want to stay consistent. Consistency is helpful because it allows you to easily spot any discrepancies, and it also makes it easier to track where link behavior types have changed throughout the network. Interchanges are generally coded as urban rather than freeway, and that's because cars are slowing down to the speed of the arterial, and they're making more decisions than on the freeway. In areas where you have merging, you want to use combined links, and the reasoning for that is because it allows or it recognizes how people actually drive throughout that merge area. And with that in mind, you also want to set the no lane change for the outer through lane. And that's because it doesn't really make sense for cars to change lanes into the merge when it's about to end. So in areas where you have merging or crossing conflicts, those should be coded with connectors. Crossing conflicts are coded as connectors because connectors are where decisions are made. This is where you use lane change distance and look back distance so that cars can know where they need to be. This allows conflict areas to be made simpler. Where you have connectors and links, you also want to set the position, the to position as 0 for your connector. This is so that it doesn't create unnecessary conflicts and it keeps all conflicts within the intersection. We want to set the to position to 0 because then if we didn't, then that would create additional conflicts and vehicles will run into each other in that area. We set the no lane change on multi-lane connectors, and that's to prevent drivers from changing lanes within the intersection. So when you're coding turn lanes, generally a crossroad right turn storage bay is coded with a separate link. This is usually consistent with a traditional intersection as well for left turns, but for a DDI, your left turn from the ramp is not coded as a separate link. The reasoning for that is because the DDI left turn operates as a shared through left. The dedicated left through lane, it can't be coded as a separate left turn bay because VISM can't really handle that. For ramps and turns, you code the left and right as separate links as far as possible upstream based on the geometry. So when you're establishing your speed decisions, Wisconsin DOT does have a default desired speed distribution list provided on the right, as shown in that white table. But we also use best practice supplemental desired speed distributions. We have all these different options for a reason, and we generally base these on the radius. Each lane should have a different speed decision because it has different geometric characteristics. And likewise, different vehicle classifications should have different speed distributions as well. All multi-lane connectors, particularly if the crossover design speed is 25 miles per hour, we assign different speed distributions for cars and trucks because they behave differently. For example, if you have a dual left, a smaller vehicle on the inside lane is going to turn and operate at a different speed than a truck that might be on the outside lane. So placing the desired speed distribution. When we have a curve, we place the DSD and the RSAs on top of each other just prior to the apex of the first curve encountered. Smith will actually give a good example of this on the next slide. And if the spacing between the terminals is greater than 750 feet, then vehicles tend to speed up within the core. And so this is another instance why it's really important that you're using an accurate background image so that you can demonstrate this correctly. And this is generally when there's a significant speed difference that takes place. People generally want to slow down for the curve, but we want to make sure that they don't speed up on the exit of the curve. So that's where it's really important to set the RSA and the DSD in the correct locations.
And of course, Whitney brings that up, and I have a graphic on the screen that doesn't show that very thing. What you see on the screen is a DDI that has a 35-mile-an-hour design speed. The posted speed on the approach is 40. So the speed differential between the approach and the core is only 5 miles per hour. So in this case, we do have the DSDs and the RSAs a little bit separated. I'll show you right now an example where they're actually combined. So you can see here that the DSDs and the RSAs are exactly on top of each other. And that's important to recognize that the reason we did that is because you don't necessarily, traffic coming off the freeway is coming down at 70 miles an hour. And as they break off, we have them coded at 60 from way upstream. Knowing full well that once they get into these curves down here in the core of the interchange, as they approach the turns, that speed differential is somewhere around 25 to 30 miles per hour. Those curves that you see on the screen are designed between 25 and 30, and that is a significant slowdown. A vehicle in VISM can anticipate a reduced speed area. They cannot anticipate a DSD, a desired speed decision. So a desired speed decision is one of those points where basically once a car has passed it, it now knows that it wants to go this speed. So if you had a DSD by itself, like right here, a vehicle hits that point and it will start to slow down to what speed you're telling it. An RSA is something that it can anticipate. So a vehicle will slow down for this. And the moment it clears that, it can speed back up. So that is much more of a viable treatment when you have a speed differential that isn't that great. So for example, this guy's moving 35 here, and he may be moving 25 here. But at the same time, a vehicle is slow, hit the apex, and then start to accelerate out. And by the time you get to this point, we've actually put in the ramp DSD, which will get it up to 60. So when you have something like this, and they're co-located, the RSA and the DSD, when a vehicle hits that DSD, it will slow to 25. or it'll slow its desired to 25, but the RSA being directly on top of that means that it's anticipating that I'm going to be decelerating down to that point prior to getting there. So that basically allows you to maintain that curvature speed all the way through a long sweeping curve. This is also something that you want to do when you're looking at a traditional loop ramp at a partial cloverleaf. So this, while this is mainly focused on DDI best practices, this is something that applies across the board. All right, now then, let's get to ramp speeds. For traffic turning onto the entrance ramps, basically what we do there, and I covered this on the previous slide, is put an RSA at the apex, make it as long as you need to kind of force that traffic to stay realistic, meaning they slow down as they approach the apex, they go through the curvature, and as soon as they can really spot the tangent, that's when they start to speed up. They don't necessarily wait for the tangent to speed up. They just need to be past the apex for it to speed up. And that's how you should drape your RSAs around the apex of that curve. On the exit side of that curve, make sure that they start at that point to accelerate up towards free flow speed, so it more closely mirrors exactly how people drive it in the field. Now, this is where we're really going to go down a rabbit hole. Signal timing. Basically, there are two schools of thought. If you go with a shorter cycle length, less queuing per cycle, but there's a lot. Basically, you may end up having issues coordinating that shorter cycle length with what's up and down the arterial, if those arterial intersections are typical intersections. Of course, this doesn't necessarily hold if you change your adjacent signals to something that's two-phase, like an R-cut or a CFI or something along those lines. If you're looking at longer cycle lengths, progression is a lot easier, but man, you really start to stack up traffic in the core and on the approaches with fairly significant queuing if you go with a longer cycle length. And one of the longer cycle lengths I've seen at a DDI is running about 180 or 210 seconds, depending on the time of day. Now, in terms of signal timing specific to VISIM, make sure you set your frequency to 10 because you really want that signal to be looking every 10th of a second. Use multiple RBCs. Even if you're not going to put multiple controllers in the field, when you're developing your signal timing in VISIM, it's a lot easier to deal with it as when they're two separate RBCs. Now, the other thing is, when you have two separate RBCs and two separate controllers in the field, think about how you're going to operate this interchange in the middle of the night. When you're running on two separate controllers, you have the ability to rest these two movements on green. Because the only reason this movement would ever need to be green, the one coming out of the core, is if somebody has come into the core. So in the middle of the night, you want to rest on these two greens, and you want advanced detection in the core of the interchange in order to really reflect, okay, a car has just entered the core. Now he's just entered the core here. He's tripped that detector. Now, because there are no calls on this side, because it's the middle of the night, I can flip that signal around and provide the green in the other direction. So it's very helpful to have advanced detection specifically for off-peak operations, which is something that we don't necessarily think about all the time. Another thing to consider, and this is true at this interchange here in Cheyenne, is you don't have to connect the signals together necessarily. If you look at this interchange, this is I-25 at College Drive. Just go find I-25 and I-90 in Cheyenne, Wyoming. Go two interchanges to the south and you'll find this. The bigger picture, if I were to zoom this out, this interchange is in isolation. There's really no corridor traffic. There's no cross traffic that goes all the way through. It doesn't go anywhere right now. Basically, what this interchange does is it serves the 3 truck stops and McDonald's that are located right here. So there's really no need to coordinate traffic as it goes all the way through the interchange. So what we've done is we've actually left both of the terminals running fully actuated, running free. They're not connected. They're not coordinated because they don't need to be. A vehicle basically that travels here, it doesn't hit that second signal. And a majority of the movements that are coming through this interchange are basically using the interchange to go north and south. So on this next slide, I want to be very clear about any issues that I'm talking about here. These are on interchanges that I've personally worked on. So the only person getting thrown under the bus is me. So this is how not to do a DDI signal timing. What you see here, north is up. Right now, the eastbound direction is about to get its red. The westbound through and the southbound left at this signal are about to get green at the same time. That should never happen. What should happen is that the westbound through should get released before the southbound left gets released. And I'll talk about why in a couple of slides. But that creates an additional lost time for the westbound through on the order of about 5 to 10 seconds because of the way that this is laid out. Now, when you put this in the VisSim, what you need to do in order to do this right is you need what you see in blue are the signal heads and the phase numbers. And you'll notice that this is signal 2, this is phase 2, and this is phase 12. Phase 2 is the parent. Phase 12 is the overlap of phase 2. Similarly, this is 6 and this is 16. The reason that we do the off-ramp turns as overlap phases is to allow us to do this. When you're looking at the, and we're talking specifically about phase 6 at this point. When you do phase 6, the yellow is based, of course, on the running speed of the approach. But the yellow and all red is designed to get you across this initial conflict point. That's all fine and good. What you just saw in the previous example at university is the yellow and all red was enough to get you past that conflict point. And there is absolutely no need to do that. The reason that we did it on that project, on that particular interchange, had to do with a shortcoming of the controller software. The controller software that we were using out there simply could not handle delay and trail green. Now, when you do this in VisSim, you will want to put a delay and a trail green here. What this means is you're delaying the start of green behind this guy. So if the delay is, say, 5 seconds, that means you're allowing phase 2 to run for 5 seconds before phase 12 releases. It might not be 5 seconds. Really, what you're worried about is this distance here. What trail green means is basically that you want phase 2 to end, but you want phase 12 to go a little bit longer because it doesn't need to end at the same time that 2 does. Just because of the nature of where the conflicts are. The yellow time for phase 12 can be different if you're comfortable doing so because the approach speed may be different. So how you judge those two yellows, they don't need to be identical. The all red time you can ignore for phase 12 because the conflict is well downstream of the parent phase's signal head, and you're kind of emulating that all red anyway. Now here's the catch. When you're doing this in VisSim, and you won't find this in any guidebook, this is discovered via straight up trial and error. Delay green has no impact. You can delay something for as long as you want. The trail green, however, the trail green value cannot exceed the parent phase's yellow plus all red. If you do, VisSim will not throw an error. It won't give you a warning. It won't tell you that anything has gone wrong. But when you look at the animation, you'll see very clearly that the delay in trail green simply isn't working right. So it will just turn around and say, all right, what you gave me doesn't make sense. I'm not going to give you a heads up. I'm just not going to work. And it actually throws the entire signal off of cycle and out of coordination. It's really unusual, highly annoying, and I wish they would fix it, but they haven't. Now, in terms of stop bars, this is going to be very much site-specific, very much state-specific, and very much based on what you've decided to do in terms of control for right turn on red. Now, in a lot of states that have multiple DDIs in place, they will allow a right turn on red from the outermost right turn lane. So the one on the far right. But they won't allow a dual or a triple right to be made right turn on red from either the center or the left lane. So when you're coding it in VisSim, make sure that you've done that correctly and that you've put a stop bar on 1 and a signal head on lanes 2 and 3, for example. The other thing you have to mess with when you allow right turn on red is to make sure that you've adjusted the headway and the gap acceptance to account for the fact that vehicles are traveling, the conflicting traffic is traveling in a way that's sort of atypical. You want to make sure that you leave a larger than normal headway and gap acceptance because drivers are a little bit more hesitant about turning right turn on red at a DEI than they are for a regular intersection. And that's also what factors into the longer stop time distribution for that stop sign, and that's only really applicable on VisSim 21 and onward. So, almost down to the end here. Measures of effectiveness. Now, there are a number of things that you need to consider when you're thinking about what measures to pull out of a VISIM model. And they what are you comparing it to? What are the characteristics of the other interchange you're comparing it to, i.e. free flow movements? And that last one's a little bit unusual and may seem somewhat counterintuitive. And that has to do with whether or not the freeway is at or near capacity. So let's hit those questions one at a time. If you're comparing it to other interchanges, particularly say a DDI to a single point, you're talking about an interchange that has two signals versus an intersection that has one. Either that, or if you're doing a partial cloverleaf, for example, where say you have a cloverleaf with a loop ramp in the northwest quadrant. Therefore, the southbound to east, the westbound to southbound movement has to go through a loop, but it goes through one signal, versus a diamond where it goes through two, or a DDI where it goes through one, or a single point where it goes through one. Depending on how you want to work that out, you really want to take a look at the entire interchange's operations, not necessarily level of service, but to at least look at delay. So what you see on the screen is not the polygonal node, but the segment node type that you can use in VISIM. And notice that you're able, when you do the segment node, to remove freeway links from it. And what this does, it allows you to more directly compare one interchange type versus another, because you're looking at the whole thing as one continuous unit, not just in pieces, not just the west terminal or the east terminal. If you are comparing a DDI to just a standard diamond or something else that has two distinct separate terminals that have the same movements running through them, go ahead and use a simple polygonal node. Just realize that in doing so, you're really hamstringing what you're able to review to analyze this and compare it to. Like, you don't want to use polygonal nodes if you're going with a single point as your other option. Now, if you have anything that involves a free flow movement, or at least a partially free flow movement, like we talked about earlier, if you have a partial cloverleaf where that free flow movement still has to go through one signal, what you want to do at that point is use travel time corridors, and just make sure that when you're doing your travel time corridors, that you've chosen geographically identical locations for your start and end point, something that's shared between all the different options that you're going to put on the table, because that's really the only way to get to a fair comparison. Now, here's the part that's a little bit counterintuitive. When the freeway is at or near capacity, the interchange makes a difference. Now, the reason, before we get on to how to do this, if you think about the amount of green time that the left turn to a freeway gets at a standard diamond, they have to go through one signal as a through movement, they get to the second signal, and then they turn. The amount of green time that movement actually gets is somewhere around 25%. If you think about how a left turn to the entrance ramp is handled at a single point, it's the three-phase signal. They get a little bit more green time, but it's usually around 35, maybe 40% if it's really heavy. If you think about how much green time a DDI gets for that left turn, it's usually around 50 to 60%. At the end of the day, what that means is the same amount of volume is going down the ramp. The same amount of volume wants to go down the ramp, but the density of the traffic as it's delivered to the main line is completely different. The DDI's delivery is a lot less dense because it has more green time to service that same demand. So if your freeway is at or near capacity, the amount of traffic that gets released as part of a standard diamond, for example, it'll hit in a much denser slug of traffic. You're going to want to turn on link evaluation for the links before, during, and after the ramp merge to really show the difference in that impact of freeway flow. On the other hand, if you have a ramp, for example, that's dropping so much volume down that you're running 16, 17, 800, 1800 vehicles per hour per lane on the ramp, you're still going to want to look at whether or not, what kind of impact that's really delivering to the freeway. So two different things to look at. Is the freeway at or near capacity, or are you maxing out the physical capacity of your entrance ramp? If either of those two cases are true, do not neglect how your interchange selection is impacting your freeway operations. Now, the reason we've been talking specifically about using VISIM for DDI analysis. And what I'm going to say is, even if you are looking at a DDI from a proof of concept level type of analysis, you're really still going to want to go into microsimulation to do it. Now, when you're doing microsimulation, the thought is, oh my God, it's so expensive. But really, the expense comes in the data collection for calibration. And if you're doing design level analysis, yes, you should calibrate. But if you don't have the data to calibrate, or if you're just doing it at a proof of concept level, doing a microsimulation is still better than trying to run this in Synchro or run it in HCM. And if you think about calibration, typically speaking, a DDI is so different than what you're putting into the ground, than what exists right now, that the only things that'll carry over are driver behavior parameters. Things like emergency stop, lane change, how quickly people react to signals. So startup loss time and headway, their desired speed, all those global parameters will carry over. So in lieu of having actual field data at your site, one of the other things you can look at is simply look at another roadway that's in the same area, that's in the same, basically the same roadway or land use context, and use some of those driver behavior parameters for your fatal flaw analysis. That's also perfectly fine. And at the end of the day, it will be a better use of your time to look at this in simulation than looking at it from a deterministic analysis such as Synchro or HCM. So on that note, I'm going to leave you with a pretty picture and a pretty movie to look at and see if anybody has questions. If not, thanks for your time.
I think we've got one in the chat. It looks like it says when the adjacent intersection is metering the input volume into the DDI and there are no plans to improve or modify the intersection configuration, what's the best practice to ensure the DDI can actually process that demand, those volumes?
See, the first question is the first half of that question is actually complicated. What happens if you have a meter? Because if you have an adjacent failing intersection that's metering traffic coming in, the problem is it's actually going to meter traffic going out as well in all likelihood. So that is something that you really got to look at from a systemic basis. From a best practice, the second half of that question is how can you ensure that your DDI is going to be able to meet the demand volume? Well, the simple fact is you really need to look at your DDI and use the actual demand volume that's trying to come in because you have no guarantee that that meter will always be there. And if the meter is somehow released for whatever reason, that they finally find unexpected funding to make that change, to make that improvement, you don't want to have built the DDI that was relying on that meter to function. So in Vissim, what we typically do is we will go ahead, model the DDI, model the adjacent intersections, put everything in there. We'll run the analysis on that, even though we have that overcapacity intersection in that model. Then we will run a second iteration where we turn those signals off at the adjacent intersections and simply let the volume flow through to emulate how much traffic actually wants to come in to make sure that we're not undersizing the interchange for what might be there. So hopefully that answered your question.
Are there any other questions? Oh, there's this was going to be my question. Is have we ever done this in Vistro?
I like using Vistro from the perspective of the fact that it gives you much better control over. Basically, Vistro has an RBC built into it, not the simplified RBC that you see in Synchro, but one that can actually handle the delay in trail green because it basically emulates the RBC controller that's in Vissim. Have I done it in Vistro? Yes, but I will go back to the fact that when you're looking at something that's deterministic like Vistro or HCM or Sidra or Synchro, you don't adequately get the sense of how progression will work between the two signals and along the corridor. And how this works with the corridor, I can't stress enough how important progression and platooning are to the function of a DDI in real life. For example, actually right here on the screen, the way it's turning right now, that intersection that you see there in the background is Cattleman Road. And for whatever reason right now with the drone happen to catch it when it looks completely empty. But that is a 4,000 foot long triple left turn lane. And that intersection in real life today has failed to the point where it backs up and spills back into the DDI. And what it does is it affects how the DDI releases westbound traffic, because westbound traffic will release differently if it sees that it's got an empty road in front of it versus if it sees that there's a back of queue just like 1,000 feet downstream. And that is something that Vistro, Synchro, HCM, that it really can't account for. So yes, I've done it in Vistro, but it still has the same shortcomings, just not the one with delay and trail green.
All right, Sandra, you have your hand up.
Yes, thank you. So I have a question and kind of hoping you can re-articulate a little bit more on the analysis of different alternatives. So for the I-41 project in Appleton, when we worked on that project, we had gone through a series of analysis using Synchro and CapEx and other things to really look at conflicting flow analysis to make our determination. Because again, it came from the thought process that we didn't really have the time or the data to be able to analyze all. I think there were 5 different alternatives for a large corridor. So I guess hoping for maybe a little bit more discussion on thoughts of if there are any other alternatives for narrowing down analysis options before bringing it into VSIM, or more information on that.
Well, I can tell you that CapEx is a good tool to help you develop a short list. I would be very careful about both CapEx and about the ICE processes that I've seen out there in the field in different states thus far, and the fact that sometimes it oversimplifies things. For example, if you start looking at hybrid type intersections, hybrid type interchanges, where you're borrowing an element from a displaced left, marrying it with a DDI and things like that, it simply can't handle some of those more specialized items. What we do when we traditionally attack an intersection is we will do that same kind of hyper simplified conflicting flow analysis, and we'll do it in either Synchro or Vistro. And what we'll do, let me see, for example, is we will boil a DDI down to something like this, something like what you see on the right, because what we're just testing is the signal with this lane configuration going to be over capacity or not? And at the same time, we'll throw that same signal into, we'll throw that same kind of plus type intersection and put in a single point. Will we map out the whole single point? No, you really don't need to. In Synchro, if you want to fake a single point, make a plus type intersection and just jack up your yellow and all red times, and you'll get a sense of whether or not a single point will function. But when you're starting to look at that, I mean, I'm not discarding Synchro or HCS or CapEx or whatever from a fatal flaw perspective. But once you've gotten to the point where, hey, these are viable and these are worth looking at, I would absolutely push at least 2 of those options into something like VSIM, because you're going to want to be able to make that comparison on a more granular level. And if you're comparing options that have different numbers of signals, or that some movements are free flow in one option and not in the other, you really need to be looking at simulation to do that. But there's no reason you shouldn't be down to 2 or 3 options by the time you get there.
Awesome, thank you so much. I did have a follow-up question. I don't know if Rebecca or Vicky or anyone would have this answer, would be regarding the signal timings of the DDIs. I know traditional like diamonds, we're in Wisconsin using like that 4-phase TTI phasing. I don't know if we're looking to continue using a similar methodology within the DDIs. Just noticing on like the simulations that were shown in the videos, those were stopping people under the bridges. And so are we looking to not do that as well? Because that would change our analysis as well, I would think.
That depends largely on your interchange. And what I'll say is there isn't as simple an answer as you would hope, I guess I'll say. There is an interchange that I worked on I-75 in Wesley Chapel. It's just outside of Tampa, where the flow rate for this movement and this movement were so high, and the eastbound through is actually so low that we ran the DDI as a 3-phase signal. So on this side, you had a phase for this movement where these two are running together. You had a phase for this movement. where these two are running together. And then you actually had a third phase, and I ran out of space because I didn't plan very well. But we actually had a third phase that was strictly just the ramp discharging, because that ramp was handling something like 4,000 vehicles per hour in the PM peak. And in that case, what we were really progressing, we were progressing this movement into this movement. So I know a lot of the standard diamond templates that are out there are trying to facilitate flushing the core of the interchange. So you're trying as hard as possible to empty the space in between the two terminals. What I'll tell you for a DDI is, no matter what this signal is doing, somebody is always entering the core, always, because it's a two-phase signal. Either the northbound left is coming into the core or the westbound through is entering the core. So the idea of trying to empty the middle of the interchange at a DDI isn't as practical, and it's not necessarily something that's required. You just have to make sure that when you're releasing one flow, that the back of the flow in front of it is already moving, if that makes sense. So everything on the DDI is going to be very site specific, even down to the phasing, the sequencing, the timing, everything. That's what makes it fun.
Yeah, this is Rebecca. I guess just to add to that, and Smith, maybe the background helps is, traditionally in Wisconsin, we've always tried to clear out that core. I realize the DDI has some uniqueness to it. I think it's actually a good discussion, probably with our signal engineers, to, I guess, determine what kind of expectations we have. Should we have expectations that we try to clear them out as much as possible? Or that they need to clear both intersections and both crossovers in one fell swoop or not. I can't answer that, Sandra, but I think it's a valid question that we may want to talk about within DOT.
Sounds good. Thank you both.
All right. Are there any last questions? Okay. It sounds like there aren't any. Smith and Whitney, thank you very much. Lots of great information. Really appreciate your time and your input and your expertise and sharing that with us. So again, many thanks to everybody for attending. I am going to put one more link in the chat. This again is to the National SimCap SimSub meeting tomorrow. Note that link goes directly to the MS team. So if you click on that now, you're going to be initiating that meeting. So maybe copy and paste that and save that in a notepad or something like that, so that you're not clicking on that and starting that meeting. But again, that's tomorrow at 1 p.m. and everybody is welcome to join. So thank you everybody for your attendance. And again, Smith and Whitney, thank you very much. We'll post this recording on our SimCap page and we'll let everybody know when it's there. Have a great day, everybody. Talk to you soon.
Thank you so much.